Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Dave, and this is my podcast. This season, we are exploring the book Deathworlds to Lifeworlds, Collaboration with Strangers for Personal, Social, and Ecological Transformation. With me today is Dr. Wahinkpe Topa, Four Arrows, who is Irish, Salaji, and a maid relative of the Ogallala Lakota medicine horse, Tyospe. Before his current professorship at Fielding Graduate University, he served as Director of Education at Ogallala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where he fulfilled his Sundance vows. With doctoral degrees in health psychology and in curriculum and instruction, including a cognate in Indigenous worldview, he authored 20 acclaimed books and several chapters and articles. He was co-founder of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 100 in Northern Arizona, and recipient of the Martin Springer Institute Award for Moral Courage. He also prepared the foreword for the book that we are exploring today. Please welcome Four Arrows. We finally meet.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, I kind of got to already meet you because I listened to a couple of your excellent interviews. So it's good to see you and be one of your interviewees.
Well, thank you. Thank you for both comments. I appreciate that very much. First, thank you for joining me today, Four Arrows. You prepared an eloquent foreword to the book, Deathworlds to Lifeworlds, a compendium of personal applications of transformative phenomenology. In it, you describe how some phenomenologists are beginning to recognize the relationship between practicing phenomenology and the power of traditional indigenous wisdom and spirituality. You observe that doing phenomenology is a path to restore life-affirming cultures. Now, how is it that phenomenology, surely a product of the dominant worldview, comes into alignment with many of the very same principles manifested in the indigenous worldview?
I actually love this question. It opens up a lot of doors, but I'll try to get really to the point. Well, maybe I won't. The other day, a student of mine referred to the U.S. government as having been founded on indigenous worldview. And she was referring to the Iroquois Confederacy, which we know was used by Franklin and Jefferson to replace the kingdoms with our balanced form of government. But they certainly didn't reflect indigenous worldview. I see sort of a similar phenomenon with this question, because in many ways, phenomenology is of the dominant worldview. And maybe we can talk about how it is and how it isn't, maybe, but the observation of how the world really works based on millions of years of observation that brought the great diversity of indigenous cultures to have these common denominators, which we're referring to as the indigenous worldview. We're certainly going to see those. Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, I never knew until I read his 1,000 pages of notes, that almost all the things that he wrote from a dominant worldview perspective, he borrowed from the indigenous worldview. So I think that to say that, or to think that phenomenology is purely a product of the dominant worldview, I don't think there really is anything that's kind of immune in the dominant worldview to being able to see the values of indigenous worldview. And I think this is what the collaborative, transformative world, phenomenology that you guys are doing in this great book. I think that is what's happening, is that there's a bringing in of the spirituality phenomenon of nature, and you're right. That that isn't part of the essential original worldview of Edmund Husserl. His notion was really unique and radical in that it moved away sort of from that over dependence on objectivity and reason, and it kind of moved into a more subjective understanding and consciousness and intentionality and all that, but it still kind of stayed with the two dimensions of looking at psychology and physical and a physical world, and I think it really, although Husserl did refer to spirit, to spirit in some of his works, I recall, I don't think it really fully captured what has been captured by Valerie Bentz and others in this with this collaborative approach to phenomenology. And so, that's why I'm a part of it. But, it's like, it's not black and white. I mean, we know that, that there's been a lot of interpretations about it. And, Heidegger, became a Nazi, and that certainly wouldn't be reflecting, some of the things that we all now agree with based on it. So I think that, it's best to really, although I look at worldview from Robert Redfield's perspective. Robert Redfield was sort of the father of social anthropology and brought worldview, which is also a term that I have mixed emotions about, because worldview doesn't really work for indigenous worldview, because we don't really see the world as much as we are in it. Very similar to phenomenology. But the worldview concept has really morphed into more and more looking at really only the two worldviews that Robert Redfield said there were. He said that all the cultures, religions, philosophies can be essentially placed under one of the two worldviews. Then he called it the dominant worldview, a metropolitan one, and he called the indigenous a primitive. But if you really look at worldview discussions and reflections, you see sort of these continual polarities of materialism versus spirituality, anthropocentrism versus animism. You see those things emerging. And I think that the newer interpreters of phenomenology are starting to weave that into it.
Mm-hmm. So would I be correct in saying that you're describing more or less a zone of proximal meaning between both the indigenous and dominant worldviews? There's a space where they seem to overlap with each other?
I think that there is a continuum, yes. I think that when I created my worldview chart, which I think we're going to talk about also, it's a binary, like life is. I mean, there's hot and cold, in and out, up and down, dark and light. But in the dominant worldview, many scholars have attributed it as being a binary worldview, whereas the scholarship relevant to indigenous worldview is often characterized as a non-binary. Well, what that really means is not that there's not both aren't looking at polarities, and apparent opposites. It's that there's a much stronger rigidity with the dominant worldview, us versus them. This is either this or that. Whereas in indigenous, Hilary Webb writes a great book on it called Yanatan, the non-duality, complementary duality of the Andean Indians. But there really is a seeking of a balancing between them, a sense of a continuum on it, so that if we look at like a chapter of a book that I recently wrote with a couple of my colleagues, is called Anthropocentrism is Killing Us. Well, that doesn't mean that we can't look at anthropocentrism and say, well, there are times and places where we have to make a decision where human centeredness, makes sense, right? So it's looking at these two sides of the chart as much as possible, knowing in our hearts that there's a balance there. I just got back from Colombia with the Kogi Indians, and they refer to the people of the dominant worldview as the younger brother, and that we've gone out into some directions and done some amazing things, but we've lost our balance with some of the essential understandings of who we are in the world. So that might be a better way to phrase that continuum that you mentioned.
Well, let's talk about the product of the younger brother for a moment. This is termed Deathworlds by Valerie Bentz and James Marlatt and their work. Deathworlds, as described in the book, result from countless deliberate, interwoven decisions and actions that become enculturated over many centuries to turn into overarching worldviews. Today, they are being perpetuated by leaders and influencers at all levels of Western society, even as we speak. Considered as an antidote to Deathworlds, on what scale can collaborative transformative phenomenology turn back the cultural tides and begin to rehumanize us?
Well, I will give a short answer for that one, and that is by looking at the Indigenous worldview as a foundation for our thinking. I think that work that Valerie is doing with Indigenous worldview is an example of it. It's about rethinking assumptions. It's about understanding that everything is truly connected, that we are part of nature, that nature is sentient. And really, I think that is allowing for the ideas of bringing consciousness to bear on experience.
Now, you and I are educators, and so is Valerie. And this book has come out of classrooms of people at different universities around the world. So that, to me, is a scale. You can approach 20 or 30 people at a time and in multiple groups. That would be a scale of beginning to open the minds of folks using transformative phenomenology. I'm just wondering how, just in your estimation, how large a group could this be applied to? Could we apply it, for instance, to a city of 300,000?
Well, there's a YouTube video called Decolonizing the Mind. It can be found if you add Misak, M-I-S-A-K, the Misak Indians of Ecuador. In one generation, David, they turned their culture around. Now, I think there were maybe 1,700, 1,800 people on their reservation, but alcoholism and depression, and only a few people spoke the language that and it was dying out. And some women and others said, we've got to return to our original ways of understanding the world. And so they brought the language back, and you'll see in the video, in one generation now, everyone speaks the language. They all they understand now the wisdom of their geographic land and territory. Their sheep grow bigger, their corn grows bigger, the alcoholism is all but gone. So that's one generation and a couple of thousand people. I think that if we can sort of reach that proverbial 100th monkey, where that we just have that last person who is a teacher, who is really bringing the decolonizing and its option, which is indigenizing, into the classroom. I think it's possible. Now, that said, I don't have hope it will happen. I believe that hope is an illusion at this time. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying I don't think that there's a chance. My definition of hope is really more about the certainty that whatever I'm doing is worth doing, no matter what the outcome. But right. I just feel that that when I look at all the wonderful requests I'm getting for chapters and articles and interviews like this one that relate to the Indigenous worldview, then I look out and see what's happening in the world, and I go, wow, it isn't reaching that 100th monkey yet. So
it's like a tsunami.
Yeah.
All right. Let's look a little more closely at the table that you prepared. In chapter 1 of the book, edited by Valerie Bentz and Jim Marlatt, we find your table titled Manifestations of Dominant and Indigenous Worldviews. Let me cite one pairing of manifestations and ask you to comment. In the dominant worldview, there is a, quote, emphasis on theory and rhetoric versus action. Whereas in the Indigenous worldview, we find the, quote, inseparability of knowledge and action. How does the dominant worldview of knowledge, separated from action, lead to death worlds?
I think that the most liberal, most progressive philosophers, educators who really see the problems in the world, that practice critical pedagogy, that with a few exceptions of people who are really activists, spending a lot of time, and even they are burning out because of things we could talk about, I guess. But for the most part, we write books, we invite critical thinking, and we offer challenges. Very few have looked at worldview reflection. So I think that when that rhetoric is in a classroom and you have the dominant worldview prevailing, which is about letter grades, getting your degree, moving on, the education system itself, plus the non-action and the rhetoric of how that education system works, it's going to allow for those who are taking action in ways that are detrimental to prevail. And I think that is the equation for how the death worlds are resulting from a lack of action. If we look at who's doing the action and why 80% of all biodiversity on planet Earth is on only 20% of the landmass, we can look to the United Nations Biodiversity Report to get a sense of why. And that is, and who? It's Indigenous people who are on the front line in the sustainability effort. They're the ones that are being shot and killed in Brazil and Colombia. They're taking action. They're not just talking about it. And so I think that taking action has got to be a part of our education, and that collaborative transcendental phenomenology has a role to play in that, which is being played when that Valerie and others did a couple of workshops in the last Fielding Graduate University sessions, and they're almost all action. They're almost all getting and doing and being, dancing and stuff like that, right? And so that's where I think that this has got to go.
Let me approach the question from another angle. In the same table, you list a manifestation of the dominant worldview as dualistic thinking, and the counterpart Indigenous worldview as complementary duality. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? What is complementary duality?
Well, that's kind of what I was talking about before, about the continuum. Complementary duality is looking at the polarities of life and realizing that, like the sun and the moon, which we could think of as polarities, they have all kinds of interactive associations, alignments, and affiliations. And when we understand that, we then can have an equal respect for that balance that they do when it's in balance, which in nature it is. In the human world, where the younger brother is out of balance, we have to seek that duality. Certainly, there's amazing accomplishments in going to the moon and in the technologies of our conveniences. And so younger brother has gone out and done that by forgetting who we really are and that we are of this earth. And so we have polluted Mother Earth, and she's suffering for it, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't seek that complementarity somehow, even if there's, largely a replacement. The mythologies of solar and lunar twin heroes are in every culture. Joseph Campbell has written a lot about them. And in the indigenous worldview, the solar and lunar stories, like, for example, in the Navajo story, Monster Slayer, child born of the water is the lunar, and Monster Slayer is the solar. And Monster Slayer and his twin brother come upon the monster with the long arms. And he says, no worries, brother, I can kill him with my bow and arrow. But the younger brother says, or the twin brother says, I think he's too fast. Well, what should we do? Monster Slayer says. And he says to his brother, and the lunar brother says, I think we should sing to him. So they do. And then monster, which is of course us, the problems inside of all human beings, our potential for greed and jealousy, etc. The monster had never been treated that way and lets them go. But you look at these same mythologies under the dominant worldview, which is only about 9,000 years old. So going back to Greek, Roman times, all the mythologies of twin heroes still exist. But what happens is they don't know about complementary duality anymore, or they've intentionally got rid of it to emphasize the solar. So Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Hercules, everybody puts on the tape. Nobody knows his twin brother Iphicles, who was equally powerful, right? So they've lost that complementary duality between these opposites. And so, as difficult as it is, in a dominant worldview that is all about it being a oxymoron or it being impossible, we have to learn that from indigenous worldview.
So it sounds as if you're saying the dominant worldview tends to see objects in and of themselves, whereas the indigenous worldview is enabled to see relationships and insight into the relationships between objects. Is that kind of close to?
I think that is kind of close. And I think that phenomenology is bridging towards that dominant worldview, because it is really what was radical about it, I think, is it was starting to look at relationships, including intentionality and consciousness. So yeah, I think that's close about the two worldviews.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Toward the end of your foreword, you say, it may be that in order for enough people to come to terms with worldview reflection, they must collectively engage in reflection, storytelling, and dialogue about the phenomenon of worldview and its relationship to life and death worlds. So, Doctor, what collective actions do you prescribe we take in order to reclaim a strong sense of social purpose to spark the regeneration of our innate spiritual reality?
Wow, that is such a great question. I mean, just the wording of it is so powerful. Well, I guess I'll have to refer to my vision on this one, which is equally powerful. I had a near-death experience when trying to kayak down the Rio Urique River in central Mexico a long time ago, when I was a young ex-Marine officer with a chip on his shoulder and did whitewater adventures, to handle my PTSD. And long story short, although this has been written about a lot, and in fact, a book has been written about it by Michael Fisher called Fearless Engagement, 4 Arrows. The cat fawn was based on an animal that was in a cave, a mountain lion called an onça, and that was the cat. And then a Tarahumara carrying a baby fawn, a baby deer that he had run down because they're great runners, for bringing back to the village. And the cat refers to trance-based learning. It's concentration activated transformation. All right. And fawn refers to 4 forces in the 2 worldviews, or that the 2 worldviews are embracing in important ways: fear, authority, words, and nature. But they embrace those in almost 180 degrees opposite ways. And when we do metacognitive work and phenomenological work, we can help people with their intentionality, their consciousness, their awareness, their spiritual understandings, to look at where did the fear, authority, and words for my problem, or our problems, or whatever problem we're facing, where did that come from? What was the basis, or the authority for the fear, the authority for being able to have this belief? What words do I use in these noun-based languages that have replaced the verb-based indigenous ones? And the end, how is nature played into this? Is nature utilitarian, which it is under the dominant worldview and the capitalistic system? Is it just utilitarian for the sake of humans? Is it something to be afraid of, or just stay away from, or what, all the things that we could say about it? Or is it a teacher? Is it what we are part of? Is, on down the line of the kinds of things that indigenous. When we do that kind of cognitive or metacognitive worldview reflection, then we have to bring it into action. And the action is using self-hypnosis, using trance-based learning, using ceremony, which is a form of trance-based learning. And so that, I believe, it answers a lot of your questions in terms about how do we get a lot of people, about how do we get the social purpose in our actual action, how do we regenerate that spiritual vitality. I've done 2 big groups of the cat fawn classes, and the feedback that I get shows that it works. And so that would be one way, just one way. But in general, go ahead.
Could you go into that just a little bit and describe trance-based learning? I don't think most of my listeners will have any language for that. If you could help out with that.
Sure.
How does that work?
Well, if we think about the kind of the traditional medicine men and women healers, right? The kinds of work that they do to do healing. A book was written in the late 1800s by a dominant worldview philosopher and medical doctor who had actually witnessed this. And he noticed that that the shaman went into the teepee with some worms and hid them. And then he did saging and dancing and singing and chanting. And then he sucked out from the belly of the man who had abdominal pain. And there were the worms, right? And so he wrote in this book, essentially, that all the shamans of indigenous people were frauds, right? Well, what he didn't understand is that was trance-based learning. That was understanding that the phenomenon of hypnosis is a powerful, natural part of human existence. And by the patient knew that he had brought the worms in, but the image of that helped him get into the phenomenon of hypnosis, which really we know is when you go into a lower brainwave frequency and you imagine, those things lead to the hypnotic phenomenon, right? And we know that open heart surgery is done with hypnosis, and we know that hypnosis is a real thing. I taught it at UC Berkeley. So in essence, it's realizing that our early childhood life of the first 5 years, we're in hypnotic states almost all the time. And that's why a teacher walks up to you in the classroom and says, David, you're never going to amount to anything because you still haven't got that math problem right. Well, if you are at that moment in a spontaneous receptivity, because during times of stress, all creatures become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. You know, many of our problems, I believe, we result from that. We're too smart to pollute our rivers and pollute our airs without it being a hypnotic phenomenon, right? And so, it's the causal and it's the solution. And indigenous people have used ceremony for that. That's what ceremony is. You have the intention to go into the ceremony, which is specific. That's the hypnotic directive getting set up. The chanting, the music, the meditative mind, you go into a state of hypnosis, and then the phenomenon of heightening your potential, which hypnosis does, is there. And it doesn't need to be done by somebody paying me $300 an hour or whatever. That's the dominant worldview operating. This is a natural thing that all of us can do.
So is there any kind of counterpart to trance-based learning that is practiced in contemporary society under the dominant worldview?
In actuality, not, because when a medical doctor says, here is what the diagnosis is, here is what you must do, most people are operating in a hypnotic state by listening to that doctor. This is why the placebo phenomenon works in 60% of internal medicine outcomes. And so hypnosis is a natural thing. It's working all the time. It's that we don't know it. So the counterpoint wouldn't be in reality. The counterpoint would be in our thinking, not that hypnosis is not happening. The counterpoint would be accepting the rigid authority of what we're told without realizing that both the reason and logic and hypnosis are operating.
So it's non-reflective acceptance of what someone is saying. And reflection is one of the primary instruments of phenomenology. So if we get people reflecting at a deep level, looking for the essences of things, they're not as likely to be, as you say, hypnotized by those who appear to be in authority over us. Is that right?
Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. Except that person who's doing the reflection has to know about trance-based learning. Because if they're reflecting on the logic only, logic as phenomenology has pointed out, and even in it, with the Husserl, we have to understand, whoa, that reflection has to include, am I buying into something because of the authority, because of the fear, and is that becoming an automatic thing? So
but this is what you mean by metacognitive approaches. Yeah. It's how we think about things.
Right.
So if I'm aware of my awareness, I'm less likely to be drawn in.
Well, we're less likely to be drawn in for sure, but not always will the metacognitive work bring us to a transformation. Without, in fact, most of the time it won't. How many things do we know we should be doing, that we don't do? That's the power of the ceremony, of the hypnosis, of the trance-based learning.
Great. Well, listen, this has been a wonderful podcast. You've given me a wide-ranging discussion on an array of very deep issues. I just wonder if there's anything I overlooked that you'd like to add to this.
Well, I think your questions really allowed us to touch on all of it, and we'd have to do another podcast on about 12 of the concepts that came out of it, right? But I think that you really did a great job of helping whoever's going to listen to this get a sense of it, and certainly they can go on and look at more specific interviews that I've done about cat fawn work and other things on the worldview chart that are available online.
Right. Well, you kind of anticipated my hope that you'll come back again. So let's plan on doing that. Thank you again for joining me, Four Arrows. This has been fantastic.
I'd be honored to. Okay. Have a good day.
You too.